First up is House File 3. And the chair will move that House File 3 be referred to the General Register. And I'll call upon the author of the bill, Representative Smith, to present the bill. Representative Smith, welcome to the Committee on Ways and Means.
Mr. Chair, members, thank you. Mr. Chair, I have an author's amendment A10. Could we deal with that now?
Certainly. Chair will move the A10 amendment. Representative Smith, can you describe the amendment?
It's a technical amendment to get the bill in the shape that the author would like.
Okay, and as I understand, Representative Smith, it removes, I believe it's $60,000 of appropriations that are no longer needed because we're not doing some of the extra mailings that were originally anticipated for driver's license. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, members, yes, that is correct. That's the reduction for the $60,000, the mailings. In addition, the programming costs are less than anticipated as well.
All right. Okay, does anyone have any questions on the A10 amendment? See no questions or discussion. All in favor of the A10 amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. The A10 amendment is adopted. Representative Smith.
Mr. Chair, members, House File 3, Real ID, gives consumers a choice. They can opt into the Real ID program or they can have the same license that they have today. The time frame for this bill, if this bill gets passed and signed into law this session, then we will ask the Department of Homeland Security for an extension, which will allow the department to issue licenses up until October of 2020, the final date. If this bill does not pass this session, we're faced with a hard deadline of roughly 1 year from today, which means that commercial air travel will not be able to happen. In addition, there'll be no admittance to federal buildings, military facilities, and also power plants. There is a fiscal, in the fiscal note, which we'll cover in more detail by staff. In fiscal year 2019, there is $10 million. That is, the first part of that is for the license that are going to be needed for people who will be doubling up within the 4-year period.
Okay, well, members, I would direct your attention to the fiscal note that's in your packet. If you look at the date, you will note that it was completed on Saturday, 2 days ago. And so we did get kind of a last-minute fiscal note on this. Previously, I don't believe, if I recall correctly, there was any sort of special revenue fund expenditure in 18 or 19. Now it is anticipated that there is something in 19, although it's, I believe, and this is something I'm going to ask the department to come forward in a little bit here, too, after we're done with fiscal analyst Mr. Lee. But there are a few changes from what the fiscal note was that we had last week, and so members, I direct your attention to that, and I think I'll have our fiscal analyst Andrew Lee bring us through this new updated fiscal note, and then I'll have some questions for the department. Mr. Lee, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. If you go to the fiscal note on the first page, you see 3 years worth of costs spread out, 10.1 million in 19, 10.1 million in 2020, and 5.1 million in 2021 on the first page. But there's quite a bit more detail into these costs if you look on pages 2 and 3, particularly on page 3 under the header expenditure and revenue formula DVS. This is the numbers that add up to the larger $10 million figure. And so this is essentially the department's estimate for how many licenses will be applied for that would essentially be free to the consumer and as a result have a impact on the revenue to the special revenue fund that funds driver and vehicle services. So in a sense, if you add up the numbers in that paragraph and then using the estimate that the agency has at the top of the page, which assumes that 40% of no-fee cards will be issued in fiscal year 2019, 40% in fiscal year 2020, and 20% in fiscal year 2021, that gets pretty close to the 10 million in 19, 10 million in 2020, and 5 million in 2021. And there's a few other smaller costs in there, a biennial audit and some essentially revenue in, revenue out relating to the second and third paragraphs further down the BCA background check requirements. So this sort of a primer in how driver and vehicle services is funded is the fees that are collected by either deputy registrars or the Department of Driver and Vehicle Services go into a special revenue fund for either vehicle transactions, title transfers, driver's licenses, and then the legislature makes a direct appropriation out of that special revenue fund to cover the operating expenses of the agency. So in offering free license cards to people that would have to renew earlier than they otherwise would have, that decreases the amount of fee revenue to one of the special revenue funds, the Vehicle Services Fund. Currently, as of the 9th of this month, there is about a $7 million unrestricted fund balance in that fund, and then another $10 million in building contingency and 2 months worth of working capital. So in effect, the cost in this bill, starting in fiscal 19, would mean a decrease to that fund, which the fund would be able to bear, assuming that the current revenue stream and appropriations are the same as they are now, but those decisions would take place in the transportation budget. That's helpful.
Okay, does anyone have any questions for Mr. Lee? Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm interested in how you came up with the numbers that you think that will renew every year or phased in. If everyone finds out that they can get a new license for free, why wouldn't people who want to have that just go and do it right away? And then what happens if everyone who's eligible does go right away? How do you pay the bill?
Yeah, Mr. Lee, you can answer that if you want, but that might be more of an appropriate question for the department. But Mr. Lee?
Mr. Chair and Representative Hillstrom, no, I didn't come up with the assumptions. The agency came up with the assumptions, and they can speak to them. I will note, though, in an earlier fiscal note, they did assume that essentially everyone would come in 1 year and put all the cost in fiscal 2021. But since that fiscal note, they have had a new estimate, assuming the 40-40-20 split.
Any other questions for Mr. Lee? Otherwise, I'll bring the department up. Okay, thank you, Mr. Lee. If we could have a representative of the department come forward to talk about the fiscal note and answer questions. Good morning. Welcome to the Committee on Ways and Means. Can you state your name for the record, and then we'll get into some questions.
Good morning. For the record, my name is Dawn Olson, and I'm the Director of Driver and Vehicle Services.
Well, thank you, Ms. Olson. Thanks for being here. I guess maybe you can start out by answering Representative Hillstrom's question. Representative Hillstrom, maybe you could repeat the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question was, how did you come up with the assumptions that everyone that's eligible just wouldn't come in if they knew they could get a free license? And what happens if more people come in than what you've budgeted? How do you actually pay for the processing of those licenses?
Director Olson.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, we base this assumption truly on the fact, on the numbers that we generally would renew in 1 year's period of time, and broke it down by the different types of licenses. So essentially, these are all citizens that would be eligible for a license, because there's no way of us distinguishing who may or may not come in. So our assumption is based on if everybody that was eligible during the period when we did not issue a real ID that wanted to come in before the end of their renewal period did come in, that's how we got to that total budget. So our assumption is based on not that we'd have an overrun, but that this is pretty standard numbers for our operation about what we would handle on a year's basis. But this would cover, or this includes not only what our operating costs would include, but as well as the filing fee that goes to the deputy registrars. Both of those we have to compensate for those somewhere, and that would be the cost involved.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the follow-up then is, what happens if more people come in than what you have assumed? Then how do you make up that money?
Director Olson.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I think we would have to take that and come before this committee and speak to that at this committee. We just don't have a definitive number to know exactly how many could come. But we would have a number to know how many that we did renew during the non-compliant period. We would have a better estimate, and that's basically what we're estimating it on now. So while it's not an exact number, we feel our estimates are pretty close to what reality could be. And like I said, if there were any major fluctuations, we would certainly come back and bring that forward.
Any other questions for Director Olson? Otherwise, I have maybe a few I would ask. Okay, so Director Olson, I guess what you're saying, in follow-up to Representative Hillstrom's question, I guess if there was some issue, this is an FY 2019 issue, we'd be back here in early 2019 with some sort of a deficiency request from the department if there were radically different numbers than what you were estimating. Is that what you're saying?
Mr. Chair, that would be our approach. If something that we had not predicted came to light and we need to make some major changes, we would certainly come to this committee to explain those changes.
Okay, and Director Olson, you're saying that with the reduced, even with the reduced revenue, I guess I just want to confirm what Mr. Lee said, even with the reduced revenue, the balance of funding that's in this special revenue account now, plus what you expect to accrue by the time you start to see this in FY 2019, that there's going to be a big enough balance in this account to still have a balance in it even after this reduced revenue?
Mr. Chair, that is our concern, is about the amount of revenue that we do have in existing driver services account, and that's where the revenue would come from to cover the costs of something like this. And so from my understanding or estimation at this time, we do not have sufficient funding in that account.
Wait a minute, so are you saying, now Mr. Lee said there was sufficient funding in the account to deal with the, I guess my question is for FY 2019, which is the biennium that we're dealing with here, is there sufficient funding in the account or a sufficient balance to get us to the end of FY 2019?
Mr. Chair and members, from my understanding how the special revenue account works, we would solely look at the driver services account. I believe Mr. Lee also talked about the motor vehicle account of revenue as well, and if I'm incorrect, I'll ask him to explain that. But primarily, as we looked when we reviewed this note, we didn't believe there was sufficient funding to cover the full amount of what was needed. But I'm prepared to stand corrected if I'm misunderstanding the request.
Okay, well, I guess Director Olson, I guess my question is, looking at the biennium that we're in, is there enough money to get us to the end of FY 2019 in your estimation? There may be another question as far as 20 and 21.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I stand corrected. Yes, there would be.
Okay, all right, okay. And I'm wondering, Director Olson, I'm not sure if you were overseeing the people that put together the fiscal note, but I guess I just would ask, in the future, boy, it's a little bit hard to follow where these numbers on the front come from in the back. You kind of have to, at least in my view, do some work to come up with which numbers add up to the numbers in the front. If there was some way when people in the department are doing fiscal notes in the future to sort of just, have a tabulation saying, here's how we got to the 10,113,000. It's these 5 items above the line or whatever. It'd be useful or easier for us to understand it. So I guess I just make that editorial comment. If you could talk to the people that work on it, I'd appreciate it. Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if I could get clarification, this money that will now be going for these licenses, where would that money have previously gone? And if it isn't doesn't usually go there. If it's a reserve, what usually would the reserve be in reserve for?
Director Olson.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, DVS has appropriated funds from this special revenue account. So we collect the fees from the transactions that we conduct as part of our organizational mission. We get a portion of those fees that are appropriated to us for our operational. The fees that we're talking about here would be the fees that have not been appropriated. They are just additional fees that we are collecting, and we have them in reserve.
All right, any other questions for Director Olson? Thank you very much for your testimony. Members, I know I had one person that wanted to testify in opposition to the bill, Ms. Twila Brase, and then one person or group, the Chamber of Commerce, that wanted to testify in favor of the bill. And, you know, underneath the rules, well, we're not looking for extra testimony, but underneath our House rules, we're required to take at least one proponent and one opponent if such people are here. So I haven't heard of anyone else. So I guess, but I see Representative Hausman has a question. Representative Hausman.
Well, Mr. Chair, I had asked about that, and I don't know whether people understood they could, because there would be the one community on the issue of the that lawful status, which we're changing in here. I don't know if anyone representing that particular issue had inquired about testifying. That would be one of the controversial pieces.
I don't believe that, no, we haven't had anyone else contact us about testifying. Yeah. And of course, that's not really a fiscal issue, but I understood that there was a possibility of an amendment on that being offered.
Having heard the testimony of at least one of the people, I think that their testimony doesn't relate to the fiscal part of the bill.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, is Ms. Brase here? Okay, is there, oh, I'm sorry. Are you representing Twila's group?
Yes, I am.
Oh, all right, okay, all right. Well, sir, if you could state your name for the record and give us your testimony.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, my name is Matt Flanders, and I'm the legislative specialist with Citizens Council for Health Freedom. Right now, the page is, I believe, passing out a few pages that I would like to bring your attention to. The first is the DHS rule that states that you can still fly without a Real ID license. We oppose Real ID because we believe that it's an unconstitutional commandeering of the state. And I know that this is a fiscal committee, and so I will keep my remarks to the finances. And if you look at the second page in that packet, it talks about the driver's license security grant program, of which Minnesota received a grant in 2011 after the 2009 prohibition on planning or implementing Real ID. And so we are curious where those funds are, why they were able to apply for them under a prohibition. And so I guess I'll stand for questions as to not get into the other politics of this. But we do oppose this bill, and we hope that this committee will address the concerns that I've stated as well.
Representative Smith, do you have any comments you want to make to Mr. Flanders' testimony?
Mr. Chair, no comment.
Okay. Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I asked in transportation, I asked the department about this issue, and they were going to get the information to us soon, and I'm wondering if they have it ready for us today.
Okay. Is the Department of Vehicle Services here someone that could answer Representative Drazkowski's question on this issue? Director Olson, welcome back.
Thank you. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, in regards to the grant that was received, we do have a chronological timeline with all the documentation to support that timeline, to explain when that grant was applied for, when it was received, and what it was used for. That should be en route to you no, very soon. The actual implementation date or application date for that grant was 2008. When we received the grant, funds were used for updating our Social Security system, where we do the verification system on Social Security numbers, as well as we got approval from Homeland Security to use that money for enhanced driver's license, for the implementation of enhanced driver's license. All of that documentation in this correspondence that's coming your way shows that, validates that information that was coming, how we got it, what it was used for, and the approval that we got along the way.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director Olson, for putting that together and outlining what you know so far. Again, as I mentioned in Transportation Committee, my understanding is that these federal dollars were DHS, Department of Homeland Security, grant dollars that were intended for real ID, and they were actually marked or marketed or communicated as such. So we were actually using federal real ID grant dollars when we had a prohibition in place in law. Is that correct?
Director Olson.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, from my understanding at that time period, back in 2008, that was the original language around the grant when it was made available. However, when Minnesota got the prohibition on going forward with any planning of real ID, we posed to Homeland Security that we have statutory authority for enhanced driver's licenses. We got their approval to go forward and implement, using the funding to implement the enhanced driver's license. There was no work done on real ID implementation. And the documentation, like I said, is coming. You'll see that timeline of how that unfolded.
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director. So I trust that that information will contain the actual correspondence between the department and the Department of Homeland Security, seeking and then granting the authorization for repurposing of those dollars so that Minnesota government wasn't in violation of state law. Is that correct?
Director Olson.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, that's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Olson.
Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on the sheet that was just handed out, in one of the highlighted portions, it says DHS notes that individuals without a real ID compliant document will still be able to enter federal facilities and board commercial aircraft. For the last several years, I've been under the impression that it was the opposite. Can someone clarify that for me?
Representative Smith, do you want to speak to that?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Representative, the Department of Homeland Security has told us definitively come January 22nd, 2018, you'll be able to board a commercial aircraft carrier with either an enhanced driver's license, a passport, or a real ID.
So what you're saying, Representative Smith, is that this highlighted language relates to the fact that, yes, you could board a commercial aircraft without a real ID, for example, if you had a passport, let's say.
Exactly, Mr. Chair, yes, exactly. And also, this is a document that is 8 years old, and I'm not sure the origin of it, so without it being the authors, I can't speak to the specifics of it, but the Department of Homeland Security has been very clear with us about the time frame that has been previously discussed about this bill.
Representative Erdahl, follow-up?
Well, just that includes the federal facilities as well?
Representative Smith?
Oh, Mr. Chair, Representative, I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question?
Yep, sorry, I interrupted the musical interlude. But Representative Smith, does this include the federal facilities as well?
Representative Smith?
Mr. Chair, Representative, yes, it does include the federal facilities as well, power plants, military bases also.
Okay.
Representative Carlson?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, actually, the last comment there I might comment a little bit about. It's my understanding that military bases in particular can establish their own rules. As we all know, military law sometimes comes under different jurisdiction. That doesn't mean that they won't make the same requirement, but the military may or may not accept these IDs, or may choose to have other forms of ID perhaps. But at any rate, where I was headed with this, and to kind of reinforce what Representative Smith was saying, I was in LA a while back. My wife was on a separate flight, and at the airports they're posting signs that the Real ID is going to be implemented. So I'm not sure what this document meant either, but clearly the airline industry is making the public aware with signage and so on at the airports. Now, I didn't happen to notice whether there's signage at ours or not, but I did notice in LA.
Thank you, Representative Carlson. Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to be clear, Representative Smith, our son graduated from the Air Force Academy and is stationed now at a military base. Are you telling me that starting January of 2018, my wife will not be able to get onto that military base, or other parents who have sons or daughters at our military academies are not going to be able to get on those facilities to go to graduations and parents' weekends and so forth?
Representative Smith.
Mr. Chair, Representative, yes. In fact, furthermore, it's even happening now. My office has a list of people, citizens of our state, that are traveling to see their loved ones that are either graduating from a program or being sent off to fight for our country, and they're not able to gain entrance into these facilities. Real ID is, the federal government is moving towards that requirement for admittance to these buildings. There's been a variety of, there is some differences among different facility military bases, but that is the direction that they're headed.
Oh, thank you. All right. Was there a representative of the chamber here that also had wanted to testify? And why don't we take your testimony, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Bentley Graves. I'm the Director of Transportation and Healthcare Policy at the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce. Just very briefly want to thank Representative Smith for bringing this legislation forward. This has been a priority for ours for the last two sessions. We were very disappointed that that didn't get resolved at the end of last session. You know, a number of our members require their employees to access efficient air travel to carry out their responsibilities as part of their work, and that's made more difficult by Minnesota's noncompliance, Minnesota being one of only 3 states. Similarly, as you just heard, while the airplane issue, the air travel issue will become a very significant issue come January 2018, the issue of accessing federal facilities of any number of kinds is already something that is making business difficult for a number of our members. So we appreciate the quick action to pass this legislation and bring Minnesota in conformity with Real ID. And on this being a fiscal committee, I did want to just mention, we also appreciate the extent to which this legislation will kind of take away the barrier to accessing these licenses by ensuring that folks can get them without cost, and ensure that you know, as many folks as possible get them quickly, so that again, commerce can move along in the state of Minnesota. So thank you very much for your support.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for clarification about your testimony, I understand that the Chamber is very supportive of coming into compliance with the Real ID provisions. Does the Chamber have a position on the second track that is in this bill, and whether or not the language related to status is an issue in the non-compliant license?
Mr. Graves.
Mr. Chair, Representative, we don't have a specific position on the non-compliant track generally. You know, I think we were asked that a lot last session as these ideas were kind of coming together, and I think our position then was, you know, whatever's necessary to give Minnesotans the confidence that they could, you know, make the choice that fit them best certainly would work. When it comes to the status issue, the Chamber has been actively engaged in a coalition of businesses that have advocated the legislature for a number of years for undocumented immigrants to have an option to drive legally in the state. That prohibition, there's currently a prohibition on that sits in regulation. This bill would carry that into law. Frankly, our view on that issue doesn't change one way or the other. We believe that whether that prohibition sits in regulation or in statute, that it is an issue that should be affirmatively addressed by the legislature, so that those who are seeking these licenses can have the confidence that it won't be taken away by whim of administration, and so the business community has some confidence as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. And Ms. Brase, we took testimony from one of the other people in your group, but if you had some response to some of the other things that were brought up, I'm gathering you maybe wanted to say something. So welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and give us your testimony.
That's correct, Mr. Chair. Twila, Brase, Citizens Council for Health Freedom. I just wanted to address a few of the things that the author has mentioned, just so that you are well aware. So the first thing is the document that's in your hand is the 2008 rule, the Real ID rule that came out of the Department of Homeland Security. You can look it up yourself. That's actually the rule. Nothing has changed about that. And when it comes to flying, even the TSA and Homeland Security says, yes, you can fly without it. TSA has a list of 13 other documents that you can fly with. We just found a military base in Arizona that has 26 identification options, and Representative Carlson? Right, is accurate that the commanders of the bases actually get to make choices, so they could decide a Real ID wasn't enough as well in order to get onto a base. And then every time that we have been at one of these committees about Real ID, we always hear that we're only one of 3 states that are not compliant. But here from DHS website itself, everything that's red and everything that's yellow are states that are not compliant. They have not complied with Real ID. The ones that are yellow have extensions until June or October. The ones that are red do not have extensions. That means that half the states in the United States are not compliant with Real ID. And then Matt may have said, but there is legislation from at the federal level in order to repeal. Our big thing, other than, of course, the constitutionality, is the fact that the Real ID for federal purposes, that the Secretary of Homeland Security has unilateral authority to decide what those federal official purposes are. Right now, they're saying flying, and they're saying federal buildings and nuclear facilities. But they agree on the back side of that page, if Matt also had the back side, I just can't remember, that they do not have to go to Congress and decide. So they could decide that driving is something that becomes an official purpose that you need a Real ID for. They could decide that buying ammunition or guns, anything that they decide. And so this whole idea even of an opt-out, eventually what they can also decide is that there isn't a not for federal purposes card, or it just becomes a moot point because they have decided that so many things are for federal purposes. So it's just very, just good for you to know that the federal government doesn't actually have the authority to impose this on the state. It is you, the legislature, who would agree to let the federal government oppose it if you pass this. And that's the reason why there have been 5 deadlines that have come and gone, and we're on the 6th. In 2012, they said that was their final deadline. In 2013, final deadline. That's what they're saying today, too, but they know they can't impose it because it would be taking over of the state authority under the federal government. So they're threatening, and that's a lot of bluff and bluster, and we hope that you will not agree to let our state be, our identification, movement, and our access to services be determined by the federal government. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brase. Are there any other questions to the author of the bill? Otherwise, I'd call upon the author to make any other final comments he'd like to make. Representative Hausman?
Have we already acted on the amendments?
We acted on the A10 amendment. The A11 amendment is one that actually I had drafted, but upon further review, I'm not sure that it works, and so I wasn't planning on offering it. And the A12 amendment, I was informed by Representative Carlson, was going to originally be offered, but Representative Hornstein's not here, and at least Representative Hornstein is unable to offer it.
And so, Mr. Chair, this is just final comments to the bill then?
If there are no other amendments that are going to be offered, we'd be on final comments to the bill. Representative Hausman.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to just call attention to that, even though that amendment won't be offered. And the frustration I have on that issue, one, that we don't have a clean bill. We've heard all the urgency, but we've attached this one issue and sort of doubled down on a particular issue. I was so glad that the representative from the business community talked about this, because really there are workforce areas all over the state of Minnesota where there's a necessary workforce there. There is, I'm told by many of the people who are both working there and assisting with some of the support services, there is usually no housing there, and so they have to drive. So that workforce, to get to, in most cases, I think it's agricultural purposes, they must drive. Years ago in Transportation Committee, this was an issue before us, and at the time, it was not controversial. Bipartisanly, everyone understood that it's an advantage for everyone in this state, from the public safety perspective, to have every person driving on the road to be licensed, because if they're licensed, we know they've been trained and they've been insured. That's a good thing. And it's a good thing, I think, when we have workforce issues around the state, to safely allow workers to get there when there is no housing available. So it's frustrating that it's attached to this bill. It's unnecessary to be attached to this bill, and becomes one of those distractions that that puts us further behind a solution that I heard the business community asking for.
Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, I also wanted to just comment on this, because the Real ID, notwithstanding Ms. Braze's comments, this is something that's starting to impact Minnesotans. I also have been contacted by constituents who can no longer get on a base where their son or daughter is serving, and that's a problem. I think we need to go ahead and deal with this, but I am very disappointed and frustrated that once again the Republican majority just can't do the right thing. And what I mean is, we've got this important bill that needs to move ahead, that we've got some broad agreement. I think the two-track bill that Representative Smith has brought is really a good solution, and deals with some of those concerns from Minnesotans who might not want to do the compliant ID. That's a great way to go. But to muddy the waters with this other language about a completely unrelated issue about driver's licenses for people who aren't documented, that is a public safety issue. I think Minnesotans around the state are really starting to understand that, quite apart from the justice issue of it, that this really impacts the state. We want people who we know are driving, who have to drive in their daily lives, we want them to be tested and make sure they drive appropriately and understand the rules just like other drivers. And very importantly, we want them to have insurance. These are separate issues. It is so disappointing that these things are being melded together. We've seen this over and over. With this Republican majority, can't just seem to do the right thing. Keep the issues separated. Move a bill that Minnesotans need right now, right away, the Real ID bill, and don't muddy it up with other stuff that is controversial. Apparently, I don't think it should be controversial, as Representative Hausman discussed, but nevertheless, there's no need to, throw rocks at a group of people that don't deserve that, and that even the business community thinks that we should do something else. And here you are muddying the waters with this very important bill. So that's my comment, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Other discussion to the bill. Representative Plowski.
Mr. Chair, I had the privilege of serving with Representative Smith at the end of last session on the Conference Committee on Real ID. And it was a very instructional service. When the Senate gave its proposal to the House, it took the side-by-sides and it circled parts, it underlined parts, there were arrows, there were balloons, and it was an incomprehensible proposal to members of the legislature. I have no idea what the public thought of it. Representative Smith's proposal was printed. line by line, page by page, with a clarity of each section of the bill so that the public and the members could understand the proposal. Whether you like the bill or not, Mr. Chair, I have to compliment Representative Smith for a presentation that was professional and that could be understood by the public. And I would hope in this legislative session we'll see that in all of our conference committees. It was well done. We didn't prevail because of time, but certainly everybody understood the House position. I have no idea what that thing was that came from the Senate.
It's often a problem, Representative Fluff. Representative Smith, any final comments?
Mr. Chair, members, I ask for your support.
Seeing no further discussion, the chair will renew his motion that House File 3, as amended, be referred to the General Register. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
Motion prevails. House File 3 is referred to the General Register. Thank you, Representative Smith.